So as you're going through the course of this year, so how does your relationship to the language change? Because you start out probably, my understanding is after two evening classes, probably like basic sentences, all that kind of stuff. But then as you're going through this process, you said that towards the end of it, you felt like reasonably comfortable communicating with people. But how was the journey from that? Because something that I've realized, and from all the folks I talk to that are learning Chinese as students, it's not that they can't practice speaking, but it's that the anxiety of doing that, especially with a native speaker, is like quite high. So how does your understanding of the language change like throughout this 12-month period, starting from two basic Chinese classes in the evening, at the end of it, you can now communicate like pretty comfortably if I'm not putting words in your mouth. So yeah, talk a little bit about that.
Before I went to China, I said, I'm going to spend a year focusing on this language. Wow, I've never done that in my life with any topic. At the end of this year, I'm going to be completely fluent. How cool is this? That was certainly very naive of me. Um, I think when I first got there, I thought uh, being in the country is going to make a big difference. And now I realize that that wasn't quite the case. I think because I was in the country focusing full time on the language, that made a difference. But um, before you reach a pretty decent level, um, me being on the streets of China didn't really help me learn faster because I was picking up nothing. I mean, I was, certainly when I first landed there after my two introductory courses in the US, being on the street and I could go into a cafe and people would ask the simplest of questions and I would get nothing. Cab drivers, I understood nothing. Maybe ni hao if I could hear if they spoke it slowly enough. So yeah, I I spent a lot of time in classes, a lot of time with my tutors, and my skills definitely were improving. But I remember halfway through my time, at the end of the first semester, when I was finished with my time in Beijing, I thought, wow, I'm halfway done with my course here, and I am so much less fluent than I thought I would be. I thought like, oh geez, after even 6 months of focusing on something full time, you'll be, you'll have such an incredible amount of skill, and then another 6 months on top of that, you'll just be polishing the rough edges, right? And that was just my own naivety. Certainly not everything about my program was perfect. There could have been ways to move faster, certainly, but nonetheless, I think language takes a long time, takes a large amount of practice. Um, One thing that I kind of want to talk about is a lot of people think Chinese is hard because of characters and tones, and I think that is true, but those things are totally surmountable challenges. I mean, the pronunciation is actually not very complicated. There's not too many syllables that you have to learn. Um, and tones, yeah, you need to spend some time on them, but if you're focusing on it and you have a teacher and you practice, most people get through that. Maybe they don't speak as perfectly, as perfect as a native Chinese person, but they get through that. And the characters, yeah, you have to learn them, and maybe someday somebody will invent some tool to help you learn characters faster. I don't know. um, learning characters is also something that you can overcome. It's one way or the other, you get through that. Those to me aren't the really hard. Those aren't the reasons that Chinese is very hard. Some of the reasons Chinese is very hard that I think is kind of the nature of the world today, which is everybody's studying English. That's a huge that is makes it a huge challenge to learn Chinese because I was in China for a year as a full-time language student, focusing on Chinese, no other goal. All I wanted to do was practice, and almost everybody who I spoke to who was under the age of 30 would try to speak with me in English. And to make matters worse, their English had been something that they had studied academically at least for at least a decade since they were in primary school or whatever. So the path of least resistance was always their intermediate English. And so if you want to reach fluency in a language, you have to you have to practice at the like beginner level, practice at the intermediate level, and then practice here. But if in that beginner stage you're really fumbling, and then other people in the country, Chinese people see you and they think, oh well, like you're trying to communicate, that's what you're trying to do, and like my English is good enough at this level, or even better than your Chinese right now. Let's speak in English. It becomes very challenging. I have many friends who were born in China, moved to the U.S. for grad school or whatever, and within 2 or 3 years, their English level is just so excellent. And I can't say this, scientifically for sure if this is the reason, English is easier. I don't think so. I think English is quite challenging. There's so many exceptions. There's lots of idioms too. Um, but the fact is, they basically speak English all day, every day when they're out in public, when they're interacting with anybody. You can't go to a restaurant, you can't go to a KFC and expect to speak to Chinese. Like you can't expect the person there to like, yeah, their native language is English, but they also speak some Chinese on the side. That's just not the case. But that really is the case in China, at least in the major cities of Shanghai, Beijing, those type of places. So, right. So the question was, I don't know, how did I feel kind of going from beginner to near the end? Yeah,
Actually,
go ahead.
actually, so one follow up question on that. So okay, so when you hit that point, because I had the same experience when I was in China, and I and not even in China. So if I'm using like a language learning app or something like that, like Tandem or italki, which are great apps for finding conversational kind of like language practicing partners for the audience. Even then, there's a tendency to default to English when something is unclear. So as you're in this stage of like beginner trying to get to intermediate, somewhere around there. So how do you deal with that? Would you just yeah, how did you deal with that?
It's quite simple to understand how to do it, and maybe not as easy to implement. But it's simply the path of least resistance. When humans are trying to communicate, they fall back to this path of least resistance. So sometimes people say, oh, just find like a Chinese speaking girlfriend, right, or boyfriend.
I've heard that all the time, yeah.
Yeah. That totally works unless that person's English is better than your Chinese, in which case you're trying to communicate and it's going to fall back to that. It's not their fault, it's not your fault, but that's just what's going to happen. So if you're looking for tutors, find a tutor who doesn't speak English. Problem solved. 100%. If you're moving to a place in China, I strongly advise not going to Beijing or Shanghai. If you have to go to one of those places, don't live in the expat areas. Don't hang out with other foreign students. Just avoid that problem entirely, and then it's not a problem. You'll still need to communicate, and it will have to be in Chinese. Um, you know that beginner from beginner to intermediate is not about it's not about being perfect at all. It's just about opening your mouth. It's just about getting your point across. Like to get from here to here, you have to make so many mistakes. You have to. You can't be like, oh, I'm just going to sit with my books and learn how to speak perfectly, and then I'm going to speak this beginner Chinese at this perfect bit, and then I'm going to learn intermediate Chinese until I know it perfectly, and then start speaking it perfectly. It's never going to work that way. You have to get some baseline knowledge and practice the heck out of it, and just open your mouth, keep speaking, keep speaking, keep speaking. It'll be lots of times you say the complete wrong thing. Doesn't matter. There's no other way. You just have to practice. So avoid the problem. Just find locations where their English is not an option, because if it is an option, it's going to be harder. Now, having said that, the problem flips too. Once you pass a certain level and your Chinese is quite good. So here's an example. If I go to say Starbucks in a random Chinese city, most people, if they're hired at Starbucks anyway, many places, but certainly at Starbucks, they probably have to have a certain baseline level of English, and they also probably know a quite well a certain canon of phrases and vocabulary, like coffee, milk, grande, hot, cold, whatever, that type of stuff. So they're pretty fluent at a small canon of stuff. And so you come in, they don't know who you are. You're speaking to them. You order something. You might try to order in Chinese. I'll have a latte or whatever, and they'll respond to you in English. Okay, no big deal, fine. But then let's say something about the order is wrong. All of a sudden you're outside of their canon. If you just stay in Chinese and make it obvious to them you're not showing off. It just becomes obvious that now the path of least resistance is clearly Chinese because I'm using phrases and words that you don't know how to use in English, and so they will no longer try to use that English. It'll just flip over. And maybe the Starbucks example isn't a good one, but it does flip. If you're in a maybe a cab, riding in a cab is a better example because the conversations can kind of go anywhere, right? You get in and usually the cab drivers will say in English, "Where are you from?" Like like that type of thing, and like, "What are you doing?" And it's great. They're practicing a little bit of the language they know and trying to be friendly with you. But then you can start talking about why you moved here, what you're doing, what cities you went to, and all that sort of stuff, and you can speak with more Chinese, and of course it will change to Chinese at that point because the path of least resistance is no longer English. So
Huh. Okay. Okay. So sorry I interrupted you earlier. So now as you're going through this, so how does your relationship to the language change as you're going through this process? So you mentioned you hit the halfway mark. It's not as your progress isn't as much as you wanted, but how does it continue from there on? Like,
my passion for it increases and increases and increases. I think there's a certain point pretty early on, not in the maybe not in your first I don't know 100 hours or 100 characters. I don't know. There's in the very very beginning. It's also challenging that it might be exciting because it's novelty, um, but very quickly that goes away and you start entering this phase where literally everything you learn is usable because you're still kind of a beginner, right? Like you're in the grand scheme of the language, you're still learning things that are used very frequently. I remember there was that second semester I was so at the end of that time I passed the HSK 4, which is certainly still kind of beginner in the grand scheme of things, but it's further than I think most foreigners get. Maybe that's true. And so that second semester, everything you were learning was like immediately applicable. You would hear it in TV shows. If you learned vocabulary, it was relevant. You could use it very soon after. You would find it in TV shows. You'd hear it in conversations. So at that stage, it was the most exciting stage, I think, for me of learning Chinese. That and really that continued all the way to into HSK 5 almost. Um, so that was great because yeah, you could like sitting and studying is maybe not so fun, but if you know that like, oh, here's a word, like I literally could have used this yesterday in a conversation, or like you learn a word and then like the next day you hear it on the subway and you're like, oh, it's the first time I've heard that word in the wild or whatever. That's a really, really exciting place to be. Whereas before that, it's quite challenging, but maybe you have the novelty keeping you going. And then afterwards, once you get into a little bit more advanced, you're learning things still very important for you to know if you want to get further in the language, but nowadays, I could learn something and I may never see it in the wild because currently I don't live in a Mandarin speaking environment all the time, but learning Chongyus or learning idioms or learning grammar patterns or vocabulary that is like way less used is more challenging because it's back to the like, oh, now it feels a little bit more like a slog because like, yeah, I have to learn it and it's like important and this is knowledge I definitely want, but if you're not able to immediately use it, it's not as fun. It kind of goes back to the university thing of like computer science versus software engineering. It's not immediately applicable, so it's a little bit less exciting. Yeah.
okay. So by the time you finish this 12-month period, oh, by the way, for people that aren't studying Mandarin too, so the there's a system called HSK, which basically measures your proficiency level. There's levels 1 to 6. It gets way harder to go up each level as you kind of progress down that path. So Daniel mentioned he was level 4, which is like intermediate-ish, lower intermediate kind of thing.
Yeah, funny enough, they measure it. One of the ways they look at those exams is by how many words you know, and so every exam doubles the amount of the previous one. So the highest exam, HSK 5, is HSK 6 is 5,000 words. HSK 5 is 2,500 words. HSK 4 is 1,200 words. So it's kind of intermediate or even beyond that on the nominal scale of 1 to 6, but you're actually less than a quarter of the way there to the HSK 6 mark. And even the HSK 6 mark nowadays is, I mean, they're about to double that all the way to, so it's still quite a beginner, even though even though I had spent so much time and so much effort and learned a lot and practiced a lot, I was still reasonably on the beginner side of things.
Right. So by the time you finish, did you finish at HSK4 or did you go beyond that? Like by the time you ended it, this exchange, where were you at? And yeah, can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, so at the end of the year, I did take the HSK4. I think I did pretty well on that exam, but at that point, it was the exam was less. I mean, before I went to China, I didn't even know about the exam. I didn't care about the exam. That was the first time I took an HSK. Some people take HSK 1, 2, 3, 4. I didn't even know about it or care about it before I went. But then at the end of my program, I was like, oh, I've been studying for a long time. Let's see where I am. I figured out roughly based on what I was studying, what should I take. Took the HSK 4. Um, uh, Afterwards, after I left China, I continued my studies and took more exams. But at that point, I had taken HSK4. It was probably maybe a little bit beyond that, but roughly at that level. And that was a really cool level to be at because certainly to a native speaker, I probably sound a little bit elementary, but nonetheless, you could get around. When I had friends visit and they saw me interacting with Chinese people, I remember one person said, "Oh yeah, this is my friend Dan. He's fluent in Mandarin." Now, in my head, I was like, "I'm so far from fluent," but like to them, it made sense because I could communicate, we could get our point across. If we were checking into a hotel, we needed things, I could ask them, I could understand the responses, all that sort of stuff was happening. So that was a great place to be in.